I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. I drove up to the main hospital building and parked in a small service lot. All day, a strange premonition had been bothering me, leaving me quite confused and distracted. I blamed it on fatigue, never imagining that I would become the prime suspect in the bloody murder of my patient. It happened in the summer of 1994, in the small town of Ogulin. I had been working at the local hospital on the outskirts of town for several years. The hospital, old and covered in moss, looked more like a haunted house than a medical facility. That night, I had just arrived for my night shift. Suddenly, the silence of the reception area was broken by the sharp creak of the entrance doors, letting in the cold air from outside, along with some night visitors. A family couple, some of my local acquaintances, entered, supporting a small figure in a black cloak. It was a young girl, short and so thin that she seemed to be drowning in her cloak. She looked like a ghost from a dark forest, pale, almost white skin with prominent veins, clear blue eyes clouded over, and a gaze that seemed dead and empty. The girl obediently followed the woman, almost mechanically, leaving eerie brownish-red footprints on the hospital floor. After seating the stranger on a chair, the couple quickly began to explain how they had found her, interrupting each other. From what they said, I understood only that they had found her on the road outside their town, just walking somewhere. Her condition raised suspicion because she did not respond to the couple's attempts to communicate, and they thought she might be under the influence of drugs. I tried to calm my acquaintances and advised them to go home, assuring them that the girl would be taken care of and that they would be notified if additional help was needed. After they left the hospital, I began a thorough examination of the girl, who sat motionless like a doll. Her thinness was alarmingly unhealthy. Her skin was literally stretched over her bones, highlighting every bone and sharp contour of her body. Additionally, I couldn't help but notice several strange marks on her body and numerous dark maroon spots resembling inflammation. I observed that her condition was deteriorating right before my eyes. Her breathing became heavy and uneven, and her temperature rose. The symptoms the girl exhibited did not match any known medical conditions. This caused concern, so I immediately took action to protect other patients and hospital staff. I quickly isolated the girl, moving her to a rarely used room far from the main medical areas of the hospital. Only after ensuring that the girl was isolated did I contact the Croatian Institute of Public Health, detailing her symptoms and current condition. I provided information about the urgent need for consultation and possible assistance in identifying and controlling the unknown infection. While waiting for the Institute's visit, I continued to monitor the girl's condition, documenting all changes and her response to the supportive therapy measures taken to stabilize her condition. From time to time, I would check the window of her room, observing the stranger in the corridor. Approaching once again, I couldn't help but notice that the situation had changed. This time, the girl was not lying on the bed, but standing and looking fearfully out the window, scanning the corridor. Seeing me, she froze for a moment, then began to trace something on the window glass with her finger. She looked slightly different. It seemed that her weakness and apathy had lifted, and her eyes were no longer clouded. However, the girl appeared very frightened and nervous, constantly looking out into the corridor, as if expecting someone or something with dread. As I prepared to put on protective clothing to examine the patient, the department doors suddenly opened. A group of 7 people entered the main corridor. 3 of them looked alike, tall and thin men, almost excessively so. They had very pale, almost alabaster skin and dark hair. The other members of the group were in protective suits, but I could swear they also looked very similar to each other. Part 2. Gently but firmly pushing me aside, they proceeded to the ward. One of them sternly asked if I had made any records about the girl's condition. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, the stranger demanded that I hand over the records. Although I wanted to object, the stranger's gaze seemed to warn me against it, so I silently handed over the notes. Suddenly, a chilling scream echoed through the corridor. Alarmed, I turned to the window and saw the workers in protective suits trying to grab the girl. She resisted, trying to break free from their grasp, but her efforts were in vain. One of the men injected her with an unknown substance, after which she quickly began to lose strength. With her last bit of energy, she struck the glass and looked at me before collapsing to the floor. They then lifted her onto a stretcher, and the entire group hurried to the exit. I spent the rest of the night in contemplation. Even as I began to gather my things to go home, the image of the girl brought to the hospital still lingered in my mind. I recalled her last look, which was haunting. She looked at me with a sense of doom, as if she knew what awaited her. Suddenly, a frightened nurse burst in, informing me that representatives from the institute had arrived at the hospital and were looking for me. This left me frozen in shock, as I believed that the people from the Croatian Institute had taken the girl a few hours earlier. When I entered the reception corridor, I immediately felt the tense atmosphere. Two men in regular office suits standing next to the local police caught my attention. The situation seemed quite unusual and strange. The initial questions from the men indicated skepticism and distrust. They even asked if I had been drinking on the job. Puzzled by this turn of events, I decided to provide the contact details of acquaintances who could confirm my story. After they confirmed my words over the phone, the men's attitude changed dramatically. They requested footage from the surveillance cameras, but it turned out that the cameras had malfunctioned that night and did not capture the events. This information only added to the already palpable tension in the corridor. The darkness in the corners seemed deeper, and the light from the ceiling lamps flickered, adding to the suspicious atmosphere. The men in suits briefly promised to continue the investigation from other sources and asked me to remain available for further questions. After they left, the silence in the corridor felt even more oppressive. I stood there, contemplating the invisible threat that seemed to surround me from all sides. Suddenly, I realized that I was at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than I initially thought. As I was about to leave the building, my attention was drawn to a conversation happening in the cafeteria. Unintentionally, I stopped when I heard my name. A police officer was questioning one of the nurses about the events of that night, which initially seemed like a simple conversation, but quickly turned into something more serious. Although the nurse claimed she didn't know the details as she was resting during her shift, the officer confidentially shared that there had been an increase in cases of patients being kidnapped for organ trafficking, and now the police were gathering information on me. This information shocked me and frightened the nurse. The cafeteria suddenly fell silent, broken only by a strange sound resembling a gasp. A shadow flickered in the corner of the room, making me shudder. I felt that the hospital walls seemed hostile, and the air was filled with an electric tension of fear. Trying to pull myself together, I hurried to the exit. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, and the sound of my own footsteps drowned out the whispers I heard behind me. I didn't look back, feeling the stares piercing my back and some invisible presence watching my every move. My heart raced as I ran outside, leaving the gloomy hospital corridors behind. I had already opened the car door when I suddenly stopped, remembering something. I recalled the girl drawing something on the ward window. It seemed like an important clue, so I quickly returned to the hospital. In the ward, I carefully breathed on the glass, where her fingerprints still lingered. Under my breath, a strange drawing of a frog and an address became visible on the glass. Later, at home, reflecting on the situation, I realized that the police might consider me responsible for the girl's disappearance. I also knew that the local police often handled serious cases carelessly, sweeping too complex or inconvenient investigations under the rug. Therefore, I decided to find the girl myself to prove my innocence and protect my name. Using the phone book, I was able to identify the girl's name associated with the address she had left. I decided to visit this address personally to learn more about her and possibly uncover the key to solving this mystery. This was the next step in trying to understand a situation that was becoming increasingly convoluted. The morning sun had just begun to peek over the horizon when I set off for the neighboring town to the address indicated on the ward glass. There, I was met by Mrs. Novak, Myrna's mother. I introduced myself to the woman as an acquaintance of her daughter and expressed concern since I hadn't been able to contact Hannah for several days. Mrs. Novak shared that she was also worried about her daughter's silence. A few weeks ago, Myrna had returned home very frightened. She didn't leave the house, staying in her room. One night, Mrs. Novak woke up to her daughter's crying in the yard, sitting among dead crows. Any attempts to talk were met with Myrna saying she was sick and needed rest. Then suddenly one day, the girl disappeared, leaving some of her personal belongings behind. However, yesterday, Myrna called and reassured her mother, claiming that everything was fine and she was focused on her studies. This raised my suspicions since I knew the girl had been in the hospital, meaning her call was a lie. As I was about to leave Mrs. Novak's house, I suddenly saw a shadow flicker behind her. At first, I thought it was a hallucination from fatigue and stress, but the shadow looked so real that it caused a sense of horror. This figure seemed to be watching me and waiting for my next move, and I felt it in every nerve. I asked Mrs. Novak to bring me a glass of water, using the moment to better observe the uninvited guest. When the woman went to the kitchen, the figure quickly moved across the living room and stopped by an old, worn-out briefcase on the table. Without hesitating for a moment, I approached the briefcase and opened it. Inside, I found a diary with the familiar drawing of a frog. Quickly hiding the notebook in my bag, I returned the briefcase to its place. When Mrs. Novak returned from the kitchen, I was already standing by the door. I thanked her for her hospitality and quickly said goodbye, feeling an urgent need to leave the place as soon as possible. On the way to the car, I looked back several times, feeling invisible eyes on my back. The wind played with the leaves on the trees, and the shadows around seemed much deeper than usual. This evening was filled with anxiety, and I realized that now I would have to deal not only with ordinary mysteries, but also with something much more mystical and unknown. In one of Myrna's older entries, she mentioned that her roommate had invited her to a party closely related to magic. Myrna was enchanted by the atmosphere of mystery and camaraderie that this group exuded and gladly accepted their invitation to join their club. I felt a heavy sadness as I looked at a photo of a cheerful, carefree Myrna and her roommate. My eyes scanned every detail until they stopped at a strange symbol on the wall behind the girls. It looked like a sun with long, wavy rays, inside which an eye was drawn. This image, painted in crimson, seemed glaringly out of place against the backdrop of the young women's merriment. Intrigued and concerned, I decided to investigate this symbol further. I knew that if this sign was indeed related to magical or even occult practices, Myrna might have fallen victim to not just a coincidence, but something much darker and more threatening. Determined to find more information, I made a note to visit the city library, hoping to find literature or sources that could shed light on the meaning of this symbol and its connection to religious and occult histories. However, Myrna's fascination gradually turned into anxiety. In subsequent diary entries, she described how her interest in mystical knowledge transformed into fear. She began to sleep poorly, noting that she felt as if someone was constantly watching her. The rituals, which initially seemed like an exciting part of their practice, started to frighten her, revealing the dark side of these magical gatherings. After one particularly disturbing ritual, Myrna fled home, terrified by what she had seen and felt. She locked herself in her bedroom, describing in her diary how fear consumed her, how every rustle or sound made her tremble. She also wrote that she had been feeling much worse lately. Her strength seemed to be leaving her body. She was constantly in a sickly state, and she had fainted several times. The last entry, made the day before her disappearance, was the most fragmented and chaotic. She only mentioned dark revival, words written in the corner of the page among strange symbols she had accidentally recorded during the rituals. Reading these entries, I felt as if someone was watching me in the room. The air in the room where I sat seemed thicker, and the darkness outside the windows seemed deeper. The invisible presence of mysterious forces, which once might have seemed like mere fantasy, now felt real and dangerous. The sound of the phone abruptly pierced the silence, pulling me out of deep thought. I instantly grabbed the receiver, feeling my pulse quicken with tension. When I pressed the receiver to my ear, I was met with only ominous silence. For a moment, it seemed like a regular connection failure, but then I heard a barely audible whisper in an unfamiliar language, slowly turning into heavy, uneven breathing. My heart started beating faster, and every cell in my body screamed of danger. I gripped the receiver tighter, trying to make out the words, but suddenly a sharp screech sounded in the phone. It made me jump. The connection was cut off, leaving me standing with the receiver in hand, my face covered in cold sweat. Shocked and confused, I slowly lowered the phone. This call couldn't be a coincidence, especially at such a late hour, and given what I had just discovered in the diary. Someone seemed to be watching me, possibly aware of my discovery and trying to scare or warn me. Suddenly gripped by paranoia, I hurried to check all the doors and windows in my house to make sure they were locked. Every lock and latch was checked with particular attention. After everything was secured, I returned to the kitchen, where Myrna's crumpled diary lay. I felt an invisible threat hanging in the air. I needed to act quickly, so I sat down at the table, unfolded a map, and began planning my next move, glancing over my shoulder every now and then, as if expecting the dark forces to reveal themselves at any moment. The horror I felt was becoming more real, and the sense that I was alone in this search only deepened the fear and despair. I remembered the police officer's words that this wasn't the first case of a person disappearing from the hospital in their district. The circumstances of the disappearance were very strange, and the doctor who admitted the patient said that a group of men had come for the girl, but there was no evidence of this. Although that doctor wasn't accused, rumors began to spread that he was handing over patients for organ trafficking. That's why I decided to continue my search at that hospital, hoping to talk to my colleague. In the morning, I set off for the neighboring town to meet the doctor who might share his story, in which I could find clues. Upon arriving at the hospital, I learned from the nurse at the reception that the doctor had just finished his night shift and left the hospital. Disappointed, I hurried to the exit, hoping to catch him. However, as I stepped outside, my attention was drawn to the loud noise of tires, followed by a horrific crash that made the air stand still. I ran towards the sound and saw a terrible scene. A car had crashed into the wall of a small building nearby, pinning between the crumpled metal and bricks the man I immediately recognized. It was the very doctor I was looking for. The scene was horrifying. The car was mangled, and the hood was covered in bloody marks. The doctor lay motionless, his clothes torn and stained with dark crimson patches. Silence reigned around, broken only by the muffled sounds of the city. When people pulled the driver from the wrecked car, he was confused and looked around fearfully. He said he had been driving calmly when he suddenly felt as if his body stopped obeying him, and the car veered towards the doctor on its own. These words made me think. It seemed to me that dark forces were trying to prevent me from discovering the truth, resorting to terrifying measures to stop my search. And then I noticed a small silhouette in the corner of the building nearby. Its feminine outlines looked so fragile that I immediately thought of Myrna. The silhouette moved, casting the shadow of a hand reaching out to me on the brick wall. But then, suddenly, a chill ran through me, causing fear, and the shadow abruptly disappeared. This moment made my heart stop. Nervous and shocked by what I had seen, I tried to calm myself and make sense of the situation. So I returned to the nurse I had spoken to earlier and began asking about the doctor's last days at the hospital. The nurse, very upset by his death, told a story that struck me with its similarity to my own experience. According to her, a few years ago, the doctor found an unknown woman bleeding near an old house and brought her to the hospital. Tired after a long shift, he allowed himself a few minutes of rest, but when he woke up, the girl had disappeared without a trace. Her footprints remained on the corridor floor, but then they suddenly stopped, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The police questioned the doctor, but he couldn't explain what had happened to the girl. Rumors about his possible involvement in human trafficking began to spread among colleagues. Although there were no direct accusations, the doctor, in turn, spoke of shadows that he believed were watching him and his intention to find the stranger himself to clear his name. However, he suddenly abandoned this idea and began to avoid any conversations about that night, his behavior becoming closed and cautious. The doctor's story deeply shocked me, resonating with my own experiences and confirming my suspicions that I was not alone in my encounter with dark forces that seemed supernatural. With thoughts of the mystical connections surrounding my investigation, I hastily left the hospital to continue seeking answers, now with a greater sense of urgency and determination. Shocked and gripped by cold fear after the morning's events, I decided to change the direction of my investigation. I remembered the photograph from the diary in which Myrna was with her roommate, and decided to find this girl, hoping to learn more about their mysterious club. Fortunately, my friend Isaac worked at the university where the girls studied, so I contacted him, hoping to use his knowledge and connections to find out Myrna's whereabouts. I explained to Isaac that I had some important medical records for the girl that needed to be delivered. I didn't want to involve my friend in this story, so I decided to lie. Isaac, unaware of the full context of the situation, agreed to help. Thus, I found out that Myrna indeed lived in one of the dormitories, and he provided me with the necessary information about her residence, also offering to accompany me there. Armed with this information, I set off for the dormitory where Myrna lived, determined to uncover the truth behind her disappearance. Upon arriving, Isaac and I approached the dormitory where the girl lived. We knocked on the door of the room where she was supposed to live, but there was no answer. The situation became even stranger when the door of the room opposite suddenly opened, and a young man appeared on the threshold, tall, thin, with jet black hair. He informed us that Myrna and her roommate had been gone for several days, saying they had gone on vacation. This information and the young man's behavior seemed very strange. What particularly worried me was the student's gaze, which seemed not just to study us, but also carried some hidden threat. Feeling an indescribable discomfort from this interaction, Isaac and I decided to return to the corridor and continue our search. As they were returning, I heard a whisper in the corridor. It was so quiet that it barely stood out among the sounds of student life bustling around. Nothing could be understood, but the tone seemed anxious, fueled by this sense of unease. I decided that we needed to examine this part of the dormitory more thoroughly. Perhaps we could still find some important clue, or at least accidentally come across someone who knew more about Myrna's whereabouts. My intuition suggested that the mystery was very close, but with each passing minute, the search became more dangerous and mysterious. Passing by the bulletin board in the dormitory, I suddenly stopped. I was looking at an advertisement for a party that seemed exactly like the one Myrna had written about in her diary. The location mentioned in the ad was unfamiliar to me, but Isaac recognized it as an old abandoned warehouse near the university. Deciding to investigate this place, we set off. The trip suddenly became complicated when the weather worsened. The sky was covered with clouds, and it started to rain with hail, which quickly turned into a torrential downpour, making the road visibility difficult. Trying to drive through the storm, I suddenly held my breath when I noticed a figure right on the road, tall and elongated, with extraordinarily long arms and unusual, almost glowing eyes. It seemed completely unreal, as if it had been pulled from nightmares. This unexpected obstacle prompted me to make a sharp maneuver, and the car nearly crashed into a tree while trying to avoid a collision. I tried to regain my composure, gripping the steering wheel tightly, every nerve tense from the shock. Isaac, sensing the change in the atmosphere, suggested postponing the search and taking a moment to rest. He convinced me to turn to the nearest bar, where we could have a drink and discuss the events. The inner anxiety only grew, but I agreed, hoping to calm my agitated mind. We entered a dark, almost empty bar where the music played softly, creating a muted, almost ghostly atmosphere. Sitting at a table, I decided to tell Isaac about my suspicions and investigations, all the while feeling as if the cold gaze of the unknown figure from the road continued to track my every move, leaving a trail of cold horror down my spine. We spent the rest of the evening in the nearly empty bar, discussing the unusual and disturbing events of the past few days. The alcohol flowed continuously, and with each sip, Isaac became more relaxed and careless. He began to joke and laugh, forgetting about the threats and strange discoveries surrounding them. However, despite the alcohol, I remained tense. I decided to drink slowly and cautiously, as my thoughts wouldn't let me rest, unable to shake off the anxiety that had seeped into my consciousness. As the evening drew to a close, I realized that I needed to act. After the last sip, I looked at my friend, who could barely stand, and decided that it would be best to send Isaac home in a taxi. I called a cab, helped my friend to the car, and made sure he left safely. Only then did I leave the bar and carefully drove home, attentively watching the street shadows that seemed suspiciously alive under the streetlights. I felt as if that unknown, elongated figure from the road was still following me, its cold gaze piercing the night darkness. I knew there would be no rest until I solved this mystery, so I decided that the next day I would return to the search with renewed strength and a new plan of action. Returning home, I felt that something was wrong. Although everything was in its place and the doors were securely locked, the atmosphere in the house was charged with a quiet presence of someone foreign. This feeling hung in the air, making every step more cautious. When I entered the kitchen, I was met with a horrifying sight. Myrna's diary lay on the table, but now it was mutilated. The cover was crumpled as if someone had squeezed it tightly, and several pages had pieces torn out. The most disturbing thing was that on one of the remaining intact pages, a symbol had been burned, the same dark sun that Myrna had mentioned. It was etched so deeply that the paper around it was charred. This symbol filled me with barely contained horror. I felt a surge of adrenaline in my blood, and my thoughts raced in search of answers. Determined to uncover the meaning of the mysterious symbol, I planned to visit the local library the next morning. Exhausted from the day's nervous tension, I decided to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was stuffy and uncomfortable, and my mind couldn't settle. When sleep finally came, it was restless and filled with fear. I found myself in a terrible dream, running through a dark, dense forest. I felt the cold air enveloping my body, and the pain from running barefoot on the rough ground sharply pricked my feet. I seemed to know that I was being pursued, feeling the breath and whispers of invisible creatures behind me. The forest seemed to narrow intentionally, leading me to an enclosed space where there was nowhere left to run. Suddenly, I was surrounded by figures in dark cloaks, slowly but surely closing the circle around me. They were approaching, and one of them held a curved, sharp knife with the same symbol that was on Myrna's diary. The last thing I remembered before waking up was the glint of the blade in the moonlight. Waking up sweaty and breathless, I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just a dream. However, the horror multiplied when I saw muddy footprints on the floor near my bed. They led to the window, which was usually closed, but now stood open. The cold night wind swayed the curtains, and my heart was filled with the feeling that the nightmare I had experienced in my sleep had a real continuation in the waking world. Realizing that I was nearing a nervous breakdown, I quickly gathered myself and headed to the library. Before that, I called work, asking for a few days off. The response I received wasn't particularly kind, but I didn't care. My priorities had shifted from everyday duties to an investigation that demanded my full attention. An attempt to contact Isaac was also unsuccessful. My friend didn't answer the calls, probably still asleep after the heavy evening at the bar. Feeling the urgency of the situation, I ran out of the house and rushed to the city library. I spent several hours in the library, poring over volumes full of mysteries and mysticism. I focused on a book about occult symbols, where I finally found a mention of the dark sun. This symbol was associated with the worship of dark forces, which, according to occult beliefs, could be unleashed into the real world to spread chaos and evil. The dark sun symbol belonged to the Order of the Dark Sun, a cult that practiced ancient rituals on the outskirts of the city, in places far from the eyes of ordinary people. I was about to finish my search when I glanced towards the corridor leading to the city archive. Then I decided to explore it, hoping to find more information. There, I discovered articles about a series of disappearances, alongside outbreaks of an unknown disease, the symptoms of which eerily resembled those I had observed in Myrna. Shortly after these events, publications appeared about a man who was accused of crimes. The public decided that he had fallen victim to circumstances, losing his mind due to personal tragedies. Suddenly, the lamps began to flicker, and each flash felt like a blackout of consciousness. In the dim light, it seemed to me that shadows were appearing around me. These shadows, like hands from another world, reached out to me, squeezing the air around. The feeling of fear and panic filled me, and gathering my last strength, I rushed to the exit. When I burst outside, the fresh air hit my lungs, dispelling the suffocating fear that had gripped me inside the gloomy library. I ran to the steps of the building, where I sat, resting my hands on my knees, trying to calm down. I held my head in my hands, pondering what I had learned. I realized that the mysterious disease, the disappearances of people, and the cult's activities were all interconnected parts of one large and terrifying story. Myrna had undoubtedly been caught in the whirlpool of these events. Sitting there, I suddenly noticed an old woman watching me. Her gaze was impenetrable and cold. Seeing that I had noticed her, she slowly turned and walked away. Despite my fatigue and stress, I got up and decided to follow her, feeling that she might provide another clue to unraveling this mystery. My steps echoed on the stone stairs as I hurried after the mysterious figure in the evening city. I followed the old woman, who, silently moving through the narrow streets of the city, led me to a cemetery. She stopped by a row of old, nameless graves, framed by thick grass and moss-covered stones. They seemed forgotten, as if the city had tried to erase them from memory. The woman began to speak quietly, telling me how the remains of unknown people whose bodies were found in the area were buried in these graves. "I will never forget those horrors," she said, her voice filled with fatigue and sadness. Although most locals prefer to forget and pretend nothing happened, she warned me that I wouldn't be able to help anyone and would never catch the monsters responsible for these crimes. "All that awaits you is fear and despair for the rest of your days," she said with such certainty, as if she already knew what awaited me. I carefully examined the graves, as if expecting some words from the faceless gray stones that could give me answers or point the way. The darkness thickened, and the cemetery seemed increasingly unfriendly and frightening. When I turned to ask the old woman the meaning of her words, I found that I was alone in the cemetery. The woman had disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. The air was cool and heavy, pressing on me from all sides. I felt as if every sound was muffled by the thickness of the darkness, and only my own footsteps echoed in the lonely cemetery. I stood there, pondering the woman's words, enveloped in a sense of helplessness and unspeakable anxiety that hung in the air, along with the barely perceptible whisper of the wind. I returned home, but after all the day's events, I didn't dare go inside. I stood in the yard, breathing in the cool night air, which seemed even heavier after visiting the cemetery. Suddenly, my attention was drawn to a quiet sobbing coming from a small outbuilding next to the main house. This sound pierced the silence, making every nerve tense. I was scared, but I still approached the source of the sound, step by step. Shining a flashlight, I cautiously peeked inside the outbuilding. There, in the corner, sat a girl, bent over her knees and crying. She was turned away from me, and I couldn't see her face. With a trembling voice, I asked who she was and how she got there. The sobbing suddenly stopped. The girl slowly raised her head, as if listening to my words, and then turned her face towards me. The sight that met my eyes terrified me. It was someone who indeed looked like Myrna, but her appearance was horrifying. Her hair was matted with mud and disheveled, her face gaunt with sunken cheeks, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her eyes completely black with reddish veins standing out against her pale skin. She stared at me for a few moments, then suddenly, with a guttural, wild scream, lunged at me. My heart froze in terror, and I began to retreat, trying to avoid a collision. But in my panic, I stumbled and fell, hitting my head on the floor. The sharp pain pain and shock made me lose consciousness, and the last thing I heard was another long, piercing scream from the girl. Waking up in my bed, I felt the fading sun barely breaking through the curtains. Consciousness returned to me slowly, and I realized that I had been unconscious for almost half a day. Memories of what happened before I lost consciousness gradually returned, causing a wave of horror to wash over me. I remembered the eerie figure of the girl who lunged at me and her wild eyes. For a moment, I froze in fear, but then a sudden wave of adrenaline and anger washed over me. I was tired of being a victim of circumstances, tired of constant fear. Deciding to act, I gathered my courage and decided to go to the abandoned warehouse, which I suspected might hold the key to unraveling all the mysteries. Attempts to contact Isaac by phone were futile. My friend didn't answer. Deciding that it was better to ensure my friend's safety, I hurried to his house. My determination grew with each step. I resolved that I wouldn't let this horror continue, even if it meant confronting the darkest secrets of the Order of the Dark Sun. Taking everything I needed, I left the house, ready to face whatever awaited me in the darkness. The journey to Isaac's house was tense. Every noise seemed louder, every shadow darker. As soon as I reached my friend's door, my heart pounded in my chest with fear and anticipation of the unknown. I knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. Finding the spare key in the mailbox, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell that immediately hit my nose was so sharp and musty that I coughed. I called out my friend's name, moving deeper into the house, but no one responded. Everything around was quiet. Only my own footsteps echoed in the half-empty corridors. When I entered the bedroom, I couldn't hold back a scream of horror at what I saw. On the bed lay the body of my friend Isaac, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. On his forehead was the cult symbol, the dark sun, and a crooked dagger protruded from his chest. The sight was so horrifying that I felt nauseous and sat down right in the doorway, unable to take my eyes off my dead friend's body. After calming down a bit, I approached Isaac's body and stopped. I carefully examined the crooked dagger sticking out of my friend's body. On the hilt of the blade was the familiar dark sun symbol that I had seen in old newspapers and on the wall behind the girls in the photograph. My heart clenched with pain and anger, and my hand, from somewhere, found the strength to grab the dagger. Pulling the blade from the body, I felt it burn my palms, quickly heating up to the point where I couldn't hold it any longer. Throwing the dagger to the floor, I heard the ominous clang of metal on the floor. I stared in confusion at the weapon lying next to Isaac's lifeless body, feeling every muscle in my body tense with fear and disgust. The room seemed to fill with cold air, vibrating with an invisible presence. With each step I took, the floor creaked, echoing my own fears pouring out. The lamp's light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed like sinister figures ready to pounce on me. With each flicker of light, with each whisper of the wind outside the window, I felt the threat hanging in the air, now closer than ever. Immersed in this atmosphere of horror, I realized that every minute alone with my friend's body increased my vulnerability to the invisible enemy. Deciding it was time to act, I left the crime scene, filled with determination to expose and destroy the Order of the Dark Sun, which now seemed not only real but much more powerful than I could have imagined. I hurriedly ran out of Isaac's house and rushed to my car. I started the engine and sped to the address of the abandoned warehouse, where Myrna had been seen earlier. The night grew colder, and the dark streets looked especially eerie. When I arrived at the place, the warehouse initially seemed empty. The building's exterior was dilapidated and ominous, and the broken windows silently stared back at me in response to the sound of my footsteps. I circled the building, looking for any entrance or sign of presence. Finding an old open door leading to a semi-basement, I slowly descended. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell of mold and something sharper that I couldn't identify became. In the basement, I stumbled upon a horrifying scene. A group of men in black cloaks standing around something in the center of the room. They were praying and performing ritual chants. Their voices merged into a uniform hum that echoed off the walls. Shadows began to appear between the participants of the ritual, as if materializing from the air. I froze in horror, standing in the darkness, afraid to move. Suddenly, two men stepped away from the group and began turning the handles of some mechanism. Iron chains began to clink, breaking the silence, and what everyone had gathered around started to rise. In the dim candlelight, I saw with disgust an inverted cross to which Myrna was tied head down. Her condition was terrible. She was very emaciated, her skin stretched over her skeleton, with sunken cheeks and almost ashen-colored skin. Her eyes were closed, and I might have assumed she had already left this world if not for the uneven and frequent breathing that shook her body. I felt my heart tearing apart with pain and anger, realizing that now I was the only one who could save her and put an end to these sinister rituals. Overwhelmed by despair and fear, I tried to take a step forward, but my body suddenly stopped obeying me. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I could only helplessly watch the ritual unfolding before my eyes. Some invisible force seemed to hold me back, preventing me from intervening and forcing me to witness what was to come. The cold I felt pierced every cell of my body, leaving traces of fear on my skin. At that moment, the figure I had seen on the road appeared from the darkness. It was terrifying, tall, with inhumanly long, bony arms and red eyes burning with hatred and bloodlust. It slowly approached Myrna, who was bound to the inverted cross. When Myrna opened her eyes and saw this horrifying creature, her scream cut through the silence, chilling me to the bone. The figure stopped by Myrna and gently, almost tenderly, ran its claw along her neck. In that moment, everything was drenched in crimson liquid, flowing into a large chalice placed directly under the suspended girl. Blood collected in the chalice, shimmering in the candlelight arranged around it. The cult members, still dressed in black cloaks, intensified their prayers and chants, creating an invisible aura of dark energy around them. These songs and prayers seemed to try to drown out the horrible gurgling coming from Myrna's throat, but the deathly sounds escaping her suffering body were forever etched into my memory. I felt each of these sounds resonate with pain in my heart, making me feel responsible and desperate for not being able to help her. Meanwhile, the horrifying figure continued its actions, the bloody streams flowing into the large chalice mixed with the ritual chants, creating a ghastly spectacle that gathered the cult in the surrounding darkness. They all, focused on their gruesome ritual, seemed part of an ancient, brutal ceremony meant to bring something unspeakable from another world. The figure in black, with red eyes, continued its actions unflinchingly, like the embodiment of death itself. This atrocity unfolded before my eyes, and I, exhausted and deeply shocked, was unable to intervene or even scream. My body remained motionless, bound by invisible chains of fear and helplessness, while my eyes stubbornly watched the nightmarish scene before me. In these moments of stark horror, as the black figures of the cult completed their dark ritual, I understood why the invisible forces held me back and made me watch this blatant atrocity. I realized that even if I had the chance to act, I still wouldn't have been able to stop the ritual. Myrna's fate was already sealed, and the cult acted with cold determination and precision. I felt emptiness and pain inside, watching life leave Myrna's body. Her groans and final breaths echoed in my consciousness, causing deep depression and a sense of doom. For the first time in my life, I felt such helplessness, standing before the inexorable fate and death. When the ritual finally ended, and the forces holding me back suddenly released me, I nearly fell. I leaned heavily against the wall, trying to gather my strength. Leaving the dark basement with its ghastly sounds of suffering, I slowly walked to the exit, barely breathing in the fresh but sharp night air that burned my lungs. I tried to find some course of action. I suddenly realized that my only hope was to involve the police, show them this place, allow law enforcement to intervene, and possibly stop the cult's activities. With this thought, which gave me a glimmer of hope, I rushed to my car. Each step echoed with a sense of pain and determination in the empty street space, barely lit by the pale light of street lamps. Now, more than ever, I had to act quickly and confidently, for not only my life, but also the lives of the innocent who could become the next victims of this dreadful shadow were at stake. Breathing heavily and almost running, I rushed to the police station, where I quickly began recounting the horrific rituals and crimes that were taking place in the abandoned warehouse. The police officers received my words with skepticism, but eventually decided to check the place I described. I kept urging the police, emphasizing the need for quick action to make it before the ritual ended. When we arrived at the warehouse, I insistently led them to the basement. However, when we entered the middle, a horrifying picture opened before us. The mutilated body of the lifeless Myrna lay among the candle butts, surrounded by traces of her blood on the floor. Next to her, among other traces, was found the twisted dagger that I had earlier removed from Isaac's body. The police exchanged glances and then looked at me suspiciously. Given the circumstances and the lack of other witnesses or evidence, they quickly concluded that I might be involved in the murder. I tried to convey information about the cult, but my words seemed nonsensical, and they decided to detain me. Already sitting in the police car and leaving the warehouse area, I suddenly saw the same terrifying figure with red eyes, which instantly dissolved into the darkness. This moment only intensified my despair and helplessness. In the cell, I incessantly shouted about my innocence and continuously talked about the cult, but my words echoed without response. A few hours later, I was shocked by the news. At the site where Myrna's body was found, only my fingerprints were discovered on the body and the dagger. This news plunged me into deep despair. I felt trapped with no way out. The poisoned atmosphere of the cell, the metal bars on the windows, and the cold walls that seemed impenetrable only emphasized my feeling of being cut off from the world and the impossibility of fighting the dark forces that had taken over my life. Everything fell into place with horrifying clarity. At Isaac's home, forensic experts confirmed that his death occurred shortly after that night when he last saw me. Only 2 people's fingerprints were found in the apartment, Isaac's and mine. All the evidence pointed to me as the sole suspect. My stories about the cult were perceived as delusions and hallucinations, accompanying mental disorders. During the search of my house, remnants of Myrna's diary were found, and in the annex, traces of her blood. All this only strengthened the accusations against me. Sitting in the cell, burdened by the shackles of accusations and misunderstandings, I pondered the hopelessness of my situation. It seemed to me that the whole world was complicit in this terrible conspiracy, created to cover up the cult's actions. I understood why no one had ever heard of the cult, why no one paid attention to the disappearances and horrific events that were happening right under the public's nose. It was perfectly planned so that all the traces led to me, instead of revealing the truth about the Order of the Dark Sun. The stories I read in archival newspapers now seemed prophetic. They told of other similar disappearances and accusations that seemed unsolvable, but always ended with the accused being convicted, while the cult, as I understood, continued its existence in the shadows. In despair, I screamed in my cell, pleading for help, for justice, but my voice was lost among the concrete walls of the prison. The night guards irritably ordered me to be quiet, paying attention only to the disturbance of silence, not to the despair of a person fighting not only for their name, but also for the lives of others who could be engulfed by this shadowy threat. The trial over me passed quickly, gathering a full hall of witnesses and acquaintances, colleagues from the hospital, Myrna's mother, who looked at me with condemnation and hatred, as well as acquaintances who brought Myrna to the hospital. All testified. Although most of them did not testify directly against me, their words confirmed that they were not involved in my descriptions of events and had seen nothing of the sort. I repeatedly told my story about the eerie figures, men in robes, and night rituals, but my words seemed fabricated, like a creepy story. My account of Myrna and the connection to the terrifying cult was met with only distrust and skepticism. The court's decision was relentless. Jonathan was declared mentally incompetent. The announcement of the verdict echoed like thunder in the silence, after which he was ordered to undergo compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital for an indefinite period. The moment when the guards led him out of the courtroom was so tense that the air seemed to thicken. Jonathan's footsteps echoed dully in the corridor. But then, as they passed the judge, Jonathan inadvertently saw the burned symbol of the black sun under the edge of the robe. The judge's cold gaze met his eyes, and Jonathan instantly grasped the horrifying truth. He tried to scream, accusing the judge of being involved in the cult, but his words seemed like the ravings of a madman to the bewildered audience. His attempt to convey the truth only reinforced the audience's belief in his insanity. Before I could do anything, the police resolutely grabbed me, and a medical worker quickly injected a sedative into my vein. The sensation of sharp cold in my veins made me shudder for a moment, before I felt my consciousness slipping away. My last vision was the judge's face transforming into a dark, indistinct mask, a symbol of the hidden threat that now seemed to have defeated me. The world around me grew darker until the darkness completely engulfed me, leaving me alone with my worst nightmares in the hopeless trap of my own mind. I woke up in a single room in a psychiatric hospital, where the white walls and barred window further emphasized my isolation from the outside world. At first, I resisted treatment, believing myself to be sane. I fought with the orderlies, shouted about my innocence, and told anyone who would listen about the cult's conspiracy. But over time, under the influence of medication and endless therapy sessions, I began to doubt the reality of my experiences. With each passing day, my resistance weakened, and I began to accept the treatment, and my stories about the cult became fewer and less convincing. By the end of my days, I remained in the hospital, silent and lost in my thoughts. I rarely spoke to others, and memories of the outside world no longer troubled me. Only at night, according to the orderlies, was there more than silence coming from my room. They spoke of a quiet whispering that emanated from behind the door. This whispering often mingled with voices, as if I were having conversations with invisible interlocutors. These nightly dialogues sometimes ended with a quiet sobbing that echoed through the hospital corridors. Whether these voices were a figment of my mind or continued to haunt me even in the depths of the hospital, no one could say for certain. Thus, I spend all my days sometimes coming to my senses, but never finding peace from the dark forces that may have caused my downfall. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.